What if I told you a king's rage in the bedroom executed 2 queens, beheaded his most powerful minister, and rewrote England's laws, all because he couldn't admit the truth about his own body? January 6th, 1540. Henry VIII tears off a disguise, humiliated. His new bride didn't recognize him. Worse, she recoiled when he touched her. 6 months later, her marriage would be annulled. The man who arranged it! Executed the same day Henry married a 17-year-old girl. But this teenage queen hid secrets in her past. Midnight encounters, forbidden touches, a sexual history she prayed he'd never discover. 2 years later, Parliament would invent a new treason law just to kill her. This is the story of Anne of Cleves, who survived by accepting she repulsed a king, and Catherine Howard, who died at 20 because she'd known pleasure before him. 2 women, 2 bedrooms, 2 catastrophic failures that changed England forever. But here's what they never taught you in school. The real problem wasn't the queens at all. Before we enter the royal bedchamber, where ministers are executed and queens lose their heads, hit subscribe. Because stories like this, the ones buried in history's darkest corners, the ones that reveal how power, shame, and lies shaped our world, they need to be told. And you need to hear them. Rochester, England. January 1st, 1540. The winter wind cut through the stone walls of the bishop's palace, where Anne of Cleves stood at a window, watching bulls being baited in the courtyard below. She had no idea her future was about to collapse in the next 20 minutes. 7 riders approached in marbled cloaks, hoods pulled low to hide their faces. Leading them was a man in his late 40s, corpulent and limping from leg ulcers that refused to heal. This was Henry VIII, King of England, supreme head of the church, destroyer of monasteries, husband to 3 wives, 2 of whom were dead. Accompanying him, Sir Anthony Browne, Master of the Horse, and 5 gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, all sworn to silence about what they were about to witness. Henry believed in the old French codes of chivalry, the romantic notion that true love transcends appearance, that a woman destined for you would recognize you even in disguise. It was a game he'd played before, a test. The woman was supposed to see through the costume, feel an instinctive pull toward her soulmate. Anne of Cleves was about to fail that test catastrophically. Sir Anthony Browne entered Anne's chamber first, announcing a New Year's gift from the king. Then Henry burst in, still masked by his hood, and did something that would haunt him for months. He embraced her. He kissed her. This stranger, this disguised man, put his hands on the future Queen of England without her consent. Anne recoiled. She didn't swoon. She didn't recognize her true love. She thanked him politely, the way you'd thank a servant, and turned back to the window to watch the bull baiting. The chronicler Edward Hall would later record her reaction. She regarded him little, but always looked out the window. Charles Wriothesley, another chronicler, noted she appeared abashed and not knowing who it was. Henry stood there, humiliated, holding the New Year's gifts he'd brought. Expensive furs, jewels meant to dazzle her. She barely glanced at them. So he retreated to another chamber, tore off the marbled cloak, and returned in his royal purple velvet. Only then did her attendants recognize him. Only then did they fall to their knees. Anne humbled herself, suddenly aware she'd just ignored the most powerful man in England. Henry forced himself to smile, to speak lovingly with her for the rest of that afternoon and evening. But the damage was done. On the barge ride back to Greenwich, Henry sat beside Sir Anthony Browne and spoke words that would seal multiple fates. "I see nothing in this woman as men report of her. I marvel that wise men would make such report as they have done." Sir Anthony went pale. His brother, the Earl of Southampton, had written praising Anne's beauty. Now both their necks were at risk. But the man truly doomed wasn't Southampton. It was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, the architect of this disastrous match. The marriage contract was already signed. The political alliance with Cleves was locked in place. And Henry VIII, wounded in his vanity, had just decided he wanted out. The wedding was 4 days away. Someone would pay for this humiliation in blood. January 6th, 1540, Greenwich Palace. The marriage ceremony was completed. Witnesses signed the register, and as darkness fell, the court prepared for the bedding ritual. This was standard protocol for royal marriages. Witnesses would escort bride and groom to the bedchamber. Priests would bless the bed, and the marriage would be consummated to make it legally binding. Henry VIII climbed into bed beside his fourth wife. What happened next would be whispered about in council chambers for months. Nothing happened. Henry later testified, in shocking, crude detail, exactly why. He told his physician, Dr. William Butts, that he found Anne's body repulsive. He claimed she had evil smells about her, suggesting poor hygiene or bodily odors that disgusted him. He told Thomas Cromwell, the very man who'd arranged this marriage, that Anne's breasts were so slack and her belly so loose that he suspected she was onto virgin. The medical terminology he used, her body seemed not like a maid's. But here's where it gets darker. Henry needed to prove the marriage wasn't consummated while simultaneously proving he wasn't impotent. Because if he admitted he couldn't perform, rumors would spread that he was incapable of producing the male heir England desperately needed. So he constructed a careful narrative for his Privy Council. He testified that he'd attempted intimacy. He'd touched her stomach. He'd felt her breasts. But he could not, as he put it, be provoked or stirred to that act. However, and this is critical, he told his advisors that he experienced nocturnal emissions on the nights he slept beside her. Wet dreams. He was saying, "My body works. I'm virile. But this woman is so unappealing that I cannot consummate with her specifically." Lord Chamberlain Thomas Audley recorded these testimonies. So did Thomas Wriothesley, the King's secretary. These weren't private confessions. Henry wanted his council to know, in explicit detail, why Anne of Cleves had failed him. For 6 months, this charade continued. They slept in the same bed occasionally, maintaining appearances. Anne, raised in the conservative German court of Cleves, reportedly had little understanding of what was supposed to happen. Her mother had allegedly told her that sharing a bed and kissing were sufficient for pregnancy. When asked later if the marriage had been consummated, Anne reportedly said that when Henry kissed her goodnight and said, "Darling, how do you?" she assumed that was the act of conception. But the king's men knew better. Sir Anthony Denny and Thomas Heneage, both gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, watched Henry's growing frustration. They saw him confide in younger courtiers about his inadequacy. They heard him complain that he'd been trapped into marrying a Flanders mare. By July 1540, Henry had made his decision. The marriage would be annulled. The testimonies were already written. The legal machinery was in motion. And Thomas Cromwell, who'd promised Henry a beautiful bride and delivered a woman he found repellent, was about to discover what happened to ministers who disappointed kings. The countdown to the scaffold had begun. July 6th, 1540, Westminster. The King's Secret Council assembled in the chapter house of St. Peter's to construct the legal weapon that would obliterate Henry's marriage. Leading this operation was Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, a man who understood exactly what the king wanted before the king even finished asking. Beside him sat Thomas Wriothesley, the king's secretary, whose pen would transform bedroom gossip into legal testimony. They drafted a document called the Attestation. This wasn't a trial. There would be no defense, no counter-arguments, no opportunity for Anne to speak in her own defense. This was a carefully choreographed performance designed to reach one predetermined conclusion. The marriage never existed. The attestation laid out 3 grounds for annulment. First, a pre-contract. Years earlier, when Anne was young, her family had discussed a potential marriage arrangement with Francis of Lorraine. No formal ceremony had occurred. No vows were exchanged. But it didn't matter. The council declared that this vague agreement constituted a binding pre-contract, making her marriage to Henry invalid from the start. Second, non-consummation. Henry's crude testimonies about Anne's body were transcribed by notary public Anthony Husey. Every disgusting detail, the smells, the slack breasts, the suspicion she wasn't a virgin, was recorded as sworn testimony. Sir Anthony Browne, Master of the Horse and Knight of the Garter, testified about Henry's complaints on that barge ride from Rochester. Sir Thomas Heneage and Anthony Denny, both gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, confirmed the king's nightly frustrations. Third, lack of consent. Henry claimed that although he'd gone through with the ceremony, his heart never truly agreed to the marriage. He'd been trapped, coerced by political necessity, forced to wed a woman who repulsed him. Therefore, in his soul, no consent existed. On July 7th, Convocation formally assembled. Richard Gwent presented the King's Commission under the Great Seal. The bishops and clergy gathered to hear Bishop Gardiner deliver what was described as a lucid speech, explaining why the marriage must be annulled. On July 8th, they reconvened to hear the evidence. Witness after witness testified. Not one person spoke in Anne's defense. She hadn't been invited. Anne was at Richmond Palace, 30 miles away, when Karl Harst, the diplomat who'd accompanied her from Cleves, received word of what was happening. He tried to prepare her. He knew the truth, a secret he'd later write in encrypted correspondence back to her brother. Henry and Anne had consummated the marriage. Anne herself told Harst that Henry lived with her as husband and wife ought to live together. She insisted she would rather be beheaded than lie and claim he never touched her. But Henry swore on a Bible that he never consummated the marriage. A king's oath sworn before God versus a foreign woman's word. There was no contest. July 9th, 1540. The letters were drawn up. The clergy of both provinces declared the marriage is null. Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves were never legally married. Both parties were free to remarry. Anne wasn't officially informed until July 11th. By then, her fate was already sealed. She had 72 hours to decide: resist and face the executioner's axe, or accept and survive. The smartest woman Henry ever married chose survival. July 28th, 1540, Tower Hill, London. At dawn, Thomas Cromwell climbed the scaffold. The man who'd risen from blacksmith's son to become the most powerful minister in England was about to die because he delivered the wrong woman to the king's bed. Cromwell had built his career on ruthless efficiency. He'd orchestrated the break from Rome, dissolved over 800 monasteries, seized their wealth for the crown, and created the machinery that executed Anne Boleyn. He'd survived court politics for a decade by anticipating Henry's desires before Henry even knew what he wanted. But the Anne of Cleves marriage was his fatal miscalculation. The Duke of Norfolk and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, had waited years for this moment. They were conservatives who hated Cromwell's Protestant reforms, despised his low birth, and feared his influence over the king. The Anne of Cleves disaster gave them the weapon they needed. While Henry wallowed in humiliation, unable to consummate his marriage, Norfolk and Gardiner whispered poison into his ear. Cromwell had deceived you. He swore she was beautiful. He promised a strong alliance. He delivered neither. He trapped you into this embarrassment. On June 10th, 1540, while Anne was still technically queen, guards arrested Cromwell at a council meeting. The Duke of Norfolk personally ripped the Order of the Garter from Cromwell's neck. They dragged him to the Tower without trial, without formal charges, condemned by an Act of Attainder that declared him guilty of treason by parliamentary decree. No defense allowed, no witnesses called, just a piece of parchment signed by a king who wanted him dead. Henry kept Cromwell alive through the annulment proceedings because he needed his testimony. From his cell in the Tower, Cromwell wrote desperate letters swearing the marriage was unconsummated, confirming Henry's complaints about Anne's body, providing every detail the king needed to legally destroy the union. He signed statements. He cooperated fully. He believed, foolishly, that his usefulness might save him. It didn't. July 28th, 1540. The executioner at Tower Hill was inexperienced, possibly drunk. Cromwell's beheading took multiple blows. As blood pooled on the scaffold, 4 miles away at Oatlands Palace in Surrey, Henry VIII was marrying 17-year-old Catherine Howard. Same day, same hour. One man's head rolling while another woman became queen. Meanwhile, Anne of Cleves was settling into Richmond Palace, signing documents that would make her one of the wealthiest women in England. Henry granted her £4,000 annually, more than any noblewoman except the king's daughters. She received Hever Castle, former home of Anne Boleyn. She got Richmond Palace and Bletchingley Manor. She was given precedence at court over every woman except the current queen and Henry's daughters. Her new title, the king's beloved sister. Anne understood the transaction perfectly. She'd written a letter of submission, calling Henry's treatment of her clean and pure, thanking him for his goodness, and pledging herself as his most humble servant. She never publicly contested the annulment, never complained about the humiliation, never tried to return to Cleves. She played the role Henry demanded, the grateful, compliant woman who accepted her rejection gracefully. She lived another 17 years. She outlived Henry. She outlived all his other wives except Catherine Parr. She attended court celebrations, exchanged gifts with the royal family, and died wealthy and free in 1557. The lesson was written in Cromwell's blood. In Henry's court, failed bedroom politics could cost you your head. But if you were smart enough to accept defeat with a smile, you might just survive. Lambeth, London, 1536. In a riverside manor called Norfolk House, 24 young noblewomen slept in a communal dormitory known as the Maiden's Chamber. These were the forgotten daughters of aristocratic families, too poor to maintain proper households, too well-born to be ignored. Their guardian was Agnes Howard, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a woman who spent most of her time at court and left her wards largely unsupervised. In this environment of neglect and freedom, a 13-year-old girl named Catherine Howard was learning exactly what men wanted. Catherine's mother, Joyce Culpeper, had died when Catherine was 5 years old. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a younger son with too many children and not enough money. So Catherine was shipped off to her step-grandmother's household, first to Chesworth House in Horsham, Sussex, then to the larger Norfolk House in Lambeth. She arrived as a child. She would leave knowing how to seduce kings. The Maiden's Chamber was on the upper floor, far from the Dowager Duchess's apartments. The girls slept together in a large room lined with beds, their trunks of belongings scattered about, teenage gossip and secrets shared in whispers after dark. But some nights, those whispers turned to something else. One of the girls, Mary Lascelles, would later testify about what she witnessed, panting and puffing. In the darkness, young women and men hanging together by the belly like sparrows. Catherine's first experience came through a man named Henry Manox. He was a music teacher hired to instruct the young ladies in the virginals and lute. Manox was older, charming, and he noticed how Catherine responded to his attention. He began touching her during lessons. She was 13. He later admitted under interrogation that he'd touched her secret parts, and that she had allowed it. The relationship escalated until another girl, jealous or concerned, reported strange behavior in the music chambers. But Henry Manox was just the beginning. Around 1538, when Catherine was 15, a gentleman named Francis Derham entered the household. He was in his late 20s, educated, witty, and he decided Catherine would be his. Derham had previously been involved with another girl in the household, Joan Bulmer, but Catherine was younger, prettier, more compliant. Derham began stealing the keys to the Maiden's Chamber. After the Dowager Duchess retired for the night, he and other young men, including Edward Waldegrave and other gentlemen attendants, would slip upstairs. They brought wine. They brought food. They held banquets that lasted until 2 or 3 in the morning. And in the darkness, while other girls pretended to sleep, Francis Derham climbed into Catherine's bed. Catherine would later confess what happened in that dormitory. Francis Derham, by many persuasions, procured me to his vicious purpose, and obtained first to lie upon my bed with his doublet and hose, and after within the bed, and finally he lay with me naked, and used me in such sort as a man doth his wife many and sundry times. She called him husband. He called her wife. They exchanged tokens of affection. And Catherine learned something crucial that would later damn her. She knew how to meddle with a man without conceiving a child. She was sexually experienced, no longer a virgin, and when interrogators asked how many times they'd been intimate, she couldn't count them all. The maiden's chamber held secrets that would eventually lead to a scaffold. But first, those secrets would make her a queen. March 1539, Greenwich Palace. The Duke of Norfolk had a problem. His family's power was slipping. Thomas Cromwell, that low-born upstart, controlled the king's ear and was filling the court with Protestant reformers who threatened everything the conservative Howard faction had built. Norfolk needed leverage. He needed someone inside the royal household who could influence the king. So he looked at his niece, 17-year-old Catherine Howard, petite, vivacious, with auburn hair and dark eyes, and he saw an opportunity. Norfolk secured Catherine a position as lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. It was a prestigious appointment for a girl from an impoverished branch of the Howard family. She would serve the new queen, attend banquets, and most importantly, she would be visible. She would be exactly where the king could see her. December 1539. Henry VIII travelled to Greenwich to await his bride from Cleves. He was 48 years old, massively obese, his once athletic frame now grotesque. The ulcers on his legs oozed constantly, requiring daily bandaging. Servants had to change his bed linens multiple times because the smell was unbearable. His physicians dosed him with opiates for the pain. This was the man who noticed Catherine Howard dancing at court and felt something he thought was dead: desire. By June 1540, while still married to Anne of Cleves, Henry's obsession was court gossip. One observer wrote that the king crept too near another lady. Anne herself complained to her attendants that her husband was fixated on Catherine. Henry showered the girl with gifts: jewels, dresses, land grants. He wrote her love letters in his own hand, something he rarely did anymore. At 50, bleeding from infected legs, his beard graying, his breathing labored from the weight he carried, Henry VIII convinced himself he'd found true love. For Norfolk and the Howard family, the plan was working perfectly. The Anne of Cleves marriage collapsed exactly as they'd hoped, and when the annulment was finalized on July 9th, 1540, Henry wasted no time. 19 days later, July 28th, 1540, Bishop Edmund Bonner performed a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, while Thomas Cromwell's blood was still wet on the scaffold at Tower Hill. Catherine chose her royal motto carefully: Non autre volonté que la sienne. No other will but his. On the surface, it was the perfect declaration of wifely submission. In practice, it was a prison sentence she'd signed in ink. On August 8th, she was publicly proclaimed Queen of England at Hampton Court Palace, and Henry called her his Rose without a thorn. Henry believed he'd married a virgin, a pure, innocent girl who adored him. He commissioned portraits showing her demure and modest. He threw lavish banquets in her honor. He gave her everything she wanted: gowns, properties, an allowance that exceeded any previous queen's. He indulged her every whim, as chroniclers noted, grateful that this beautiful young woman had chosen to love an aging, diseased king. What Henry didn't know, what the Howard family had carefully concealed, was that Catherine's education in the maiden's chamber had been far more comprehensive than music lessons. Henry Mannix had taught her pleasure. Francis Derham had taught her deception. And both men were still alive, carrying secrets that could destroy a queen. The honeymoon would last exactly 16 months before those secrets crawled out of the darkness and onto the scaffold. Spring 1541, Hampton Court Palace. While Henry VIII slept in his chambers, his ulcerated legs bandaged and oozing, his teenage wife was sending coded messages to a man who served in the king's privy chamber. His name was Thomas Culpeper, and he was everything Henry used to be: young, athletic, handsome, and dangerous. Culpeper was one of Henry's favorites. He attended the king's most private moments, helped dress him, carried his personal correspondence, and knew the palace's secret passages better than anyone. He was also Catherine's distant cousin, which gave him easy access to the Queen's chambers without arousing immediate suspicion. But their relationship had crossed from familial to forbidden, and someone was facilitating every encounter. Lady Jane Rochford, widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's executed brother, served as Catherine's senior lady-in-waiting. Jane had survived her husband's execution in 1536 by testifying against him. claiming he'd committed incest with his sister. Now, 4 years later, she was arranging clandestine meetings between a queen and the king's gentlemen, fully aware that discovery meant death for everyone involved. The meetings began during the Northern Progress, a royal tour through Yorkshire and Lincolnshire in summer 1541. Henry wanted to show off his young queen to his northern subjects, to prove his vitality after the Anne of Cleves humiliation. But while he slept, exhausted from travel and pain, Jane Rochford was unlocking back staircases. Catherine would later confess the mechanics of their encounters. Jane arranged the times, usually between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. She stood guard outside the door, while Culpeper slipped into the Queen's chambers. Sometimes they met in Jane's own rooms to avoid suspicion. At Lincoln, they met in a public privy, a latrine attached to the palace, because it was the only place nobody would question two people entering separately. But what actually happened during these meetings? Culpeper claimed they only talked. He swore under interrogation that he loved the Queen, that she'd shown him favor since before her marriage to Henry, but that they'd never committed adultery. Catherine's confession was more complicated. She admitted the meetings. She admitted being alone with him. She even admitted that she intended and meant to do ill with him. But she insisted Culpeper pursued her, that Jane Rochford pressured her to see him, that she was so much abashed by his advances that she didn't know how to refuse. Then there were the letters. Catherine had written to Culpeper in her own hand, calling him yours as long as life endures, and signing it with her name. She'd given him gifts, a silk doublet, a jeweled cap. He'd given her a chain and a bracelet. These weren't the exchanges of casual acquaintances. The most damning testimony came from Culpeper himself. He admitted that on one occasion at Lincoln, Catherine told him, "If the king were dead, I would marry you. Not, I love you. Not, I miss you." But a direct statement imagining the king's death and their future together. That sentence alone was treason, whether they touched each other or not. The question of actual adultery would never be definitively answered. But in Henry VIII's England, intention was enough. Planning to betray the king, imagining his death, meeting a man secretly while your husband slept, these were sufficient grounds for execution. And in November 1541, when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer received an anonymous letter detailing Catherine's past and present indiscretions, that machinery of death began turning. The midnight meetings were about to become scaffold confessions. November 1st, 1541. All Saints' Day, Hampton Court Palace. Effu Henry VII attended Mass, gave thanks to God for his beautiful young wife, and ordered a feast in celebration. While he prayed, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer stood in the Chapel Royal clutching a letter that would destroy everything. The letter had been delivered by John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer whose sister Mary had served in the Maiden's Chamber with Catherine Howard years earlier. Mary Lascelles had witnessed things. Midnight visitors, Henry Manox touching Catherine inappropriately, Francis Derham climbing into the girl's bed. And now that girl was Queen of England, and Mary's conscience was screaming. John brought the accusations to Cranmer, because approaching the king directly with such claims could get a man executed if they proved false. Cranmer waited until Henry left Mass, then slipped the letter onto the king's seat in the Chapel Royal. He couldn't speak the words aloud. He couldn't risk Henry's immediate rage. So he let the parchment do the work. Henry read it alone. His first reaction was disbelief. This was slander. Lies from Protestant reformers trying to destroy his Catholic queen and the Howard family's power. He ordered an investigation, convinced it would clear Catherine's name and expose her accusers. He commanded Cranmer to interrogate everyone named in the letter personally. "Find the truth," he said. "Prove my wife is innocent." Cranmer began with Henry Manox. The music teacher confessed immediately. Yes, he'd touched the queen, when she was just Catherine Howard, a 13-year-old student. Yes, he'd been intimate with her, though he claimed they'd never fully consummated. Then came Francis Derham. Under interrogation, Derham admitted he'd slept with Catherine 100 times. He called her his wife. He said she'd given herself to him willingly. When Cranmer arrived at Catherine's chambers to question her, he found her hysterical. She was barely coherent, sobbing so violently that he later wrote to the council, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature. She confessed everything about her past. Mannix's touching, Derham's bed-sharing, the midnight banquets in the maiden's chamber. She begged for mercy, swearing she'd been young, manipulated, that she'd hidden it because she was ashamed." Then Cranmer asked about Thomas Culpeper. Catherine's hysteria intensified. Yes, they'd met. Yes, Jane Rochford arranged it. But they'd only talked, she insisted. Nothing physical happened. She'd been foolish, she admitted, but not treasonous. Henry received Cranmer's report on November 6th. The king who'd executed ministers and wives, who'd broken from Rome and dissolved monasteries, who'd faced down rebellions and political enemies. This man collapsed. Witnesses reported he wept openly in council meetings. He called for a sword so he could kill Catherine himself. He raged that she'd never loved him, that she'd deceived him, that everyone had known and hidden it from him. The French ambassador, Charles de Marillac, wrote that Henry's grief was pitiable, and that some feared for his sanity. But beneath the grief was something darker: humiliation. Catherine hadn't just betrayed him. She'd made him look foolish. A 50-year-old king, showering a teenage girl with wealth and titles, believing she adored him when she'd been thinking of younger men. The entire court had watched him play the fool. On November 14th, Catherine was stripped of her title as queen. She was no longer Her Majesty. She was just Catherine Howard again, and her countdown to the scaffold had begun. January 1542. Westminster Palace. Parliament assembled with an unusual task: create a law that didn't exist when the crime was committed, then use it to execute a woman retroactively. This wasn't justice. This was legal murder dressed in legislative robes. The problem was simple. Catherine Howard had hidden her sexual past from Henry VIII. She'd allowed him to believe she was a virgin when she married him in July 1540. Under existing law, this was shameful, disgraceful, grounds for annulment, but not treason. And Henry didn't want an annulment. He wanted her head. So Parliament invented a new crime specifically designed to kill Catherine Howard. Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley, the same man who'd helped construct Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, led the drafting. Beside him sat Thomas Wriothesley, now elevated to principal secretary, a man who understood that laws were tools kings wielded against inconvenient women. The bill they created was called an Act of Attainder, a legislative conviction that required no trial, no jury, no opportunity for the accused to defend themselves. Parliament would simply declare someone guilty, and that declaration became law. It had been used to execute Thomas Cromwell without trial in 1540. Now it would be weaponized against a teenage queen. On February 7th, 1542, the bill was formally introduced to Parliament. Its language was precise and devastating. It declared that any woman who married the king, while not being a pure and clean maid, but failed to disclose her sexual history before the marriage, would be guilty of high treason, punishable by death. Furthermore, anyone who knowingly aided such a woman, covering up her past, facilitating secret meetings, enabling adultery, would also face execution. But here's what made it truly sinister. The law was retroactive. Catherine had married Henry in July 1540. This law was being written in February 1542. Under normal legal principles, you cannot be punished for violating a law that didn't exist when you committed the act. But kings don't follow normal legal principles. The bill named Catherine Howard specifically. It detailed her relationship with Francis Derham, her midnight meetings with Thomas Culpeper, and Lady Jane Rochford's role in facilitating those encounters. It declared that by concealing her sexual history and engaging in suspected adultery, Catherine had committed treason against the crown, the realm, and the king's majesty. On February 11th, 1542, the bill passed both houses of Parliament. But there was one final procedural hurdle. It required royal assent, the king's signature. Henry, still devastated and humiliated, couldn't bring himself to sign his wife's death warrant personally. So Parliament passed another law, the Royal Assent by Commission Act of 1541, which allowed commissioners to grant royal assent on the king's behalf. Henry appointed Lord Chancellor Audley and several others to sign in his place. The law was now active. Catherine Howard, who'd been stripped of her queenship in November, was now formally guilty of treason by parliamentary decree. No trial had occurred. No defense had been heard. No jury had deliberated. A group of men in Westminster had simply written her guilt into law, and that was sufficient. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper had already been executed on December 10th, 1541. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, the traitor's death. Culpeper, because of his closeness to the king, was granted the mercy of beheading. Their heads were placed on spikes on London Bridge as warnings. Now it was Catherine and Jane Rochford's turn. The scaffold was being prepared. The executioner was sharpening his axe. And on February 10th, 1542, guards arrived at Sion Abbey, where Catherine had been imprisoned to take her to the Tower of London. The machinery of death was fully operational. February 10th, 1542, Sion Abbey. The guards arrived at dawn to take Catherine Howard to the Tower of London. She'd been imprisoned there since November, stripped of her title, abandoned by her family, waiting for a fate everyone knew was coming. When they told her it was time to go, she panicked. Witnesses reported she screamed and fought as they dragged her toward the barge. She knew what passing through the Traitor's Gate meant. No queen who entered the tower accused of treason ever walked out alive. The barge journey down the Thames was short, but nightmarish. As the vessel approached London Bridge, Catherine would have looked up and seen them. Two decomposing heads mounted on spikes above the bridge's southern entrance. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham, the men whose names had destroyed her, had been executed on December 10th. Their heads had been rotting there for 2 months, a warning to anyone who betrayed the king. Catherine passed directly beneath them. The barge turned towards the tower's water entrance, the infamous Traitor's Gate. The heavy portcullis lifted, and Catherine was escorted through the archway where Anne Boleyn had entered 6 years earlier. Sir John Gage, constable of the tower, led her to the Queen's apartments in the Lieutenant's lodging, the same rooms where Anne Boleyn had spent her final days. The stone walls, the narrow windows, the knowledge that the scaffold was being built outside. On February 11th, the Bill of Attainder received royal assent. Catherine's execution was formally scheduled. Sir John Gage informed her that she would die on Monday morning, February 13th, at 7 o'clock. She had 3 days left. What Catherine did in those final hours became Tudor legend. Multiple sources claim she requested the executioner's block be brought to her chamber. She wanted to practice. The teenage girl who'd once danced at court, who'd worn jewels and silk, who'd been called the King's Rose without a thorn, spent her last night kneeling before a wooden block, positioning her neck, rehearsing her own beheading. She was terrified of a botched execution, of the axe striking her shoulders, her face, of dying slowly in agony while courtiers watched. Her ladies-in-waiting tried to comfort her. They prayed with her. They dressed her in a black damask gown. But nothing could erase the reality. In a few hours, her head would be separated from her body, and she would be buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor. On the evening of February 12th, Jane Rochford was brought to the chamber next to Catherine's. The two women who'd arranged midnight meetings with Thomas Culpeper would die together. Jane had reportedly suffered a mental breakdown during her imprisonment, becoming incoherent and hysterical. Some wondered if she was too insane to be executed. Henry's government didn't care. Parliament had declared both women guilty. The machinery couldn't be stopped. February 13th, 1542. Dawn broke over the Tower of London. The scaffold was ready. The executioner had sharpened his axe, and two women prepared to face the blade for the crime of disappointing a king. February 13th, 1542, Tower Green, 7 o'clock in the morning. The sun had barely risen over the Thames when guards escorted Catherine Howard from her cell to the private execution ground inside the tower walls. This wouldn't be a public spectacle like the executions at Tower Hill or Tyburn. Queens died privately, witnessed only by the council, tower officials, and a handful of carefully selected observers who could be trusted to report the king's version of events. Catherine was 19 years old, maybe 20. Her exact birth year was never recorded because daughters of impoverished nobles weren't considered important enough to document. She'd been queen for 16 months. Now she could barely stand. Guards had to support her as she climbed the scaffold steps, her legs shaking so violently they feared she'd collapse before reaching the block. The executioner waited, a professional headsman brought in from France, the same man who'd executed Thomas Cromwell 2 years earlier. He was skilled. Quick. The axe was sharp. Catherine had spent the previous night practicing for this moment, kneeling at the block repeatedly, positioning her neck so the blade would strike cleanly. Now, facing the actual wood stained with the blood of Anne Boleyn and others who died here, all that rehearsal felt insufficient. She spoke briefly to the assembled witnesses. Her voice was weak but clear. She confessed that she deserved death. Some accounts claim she said she deserved 100 deaths for her sins. She didn't protest her innocence. She didn't curse Henry. She acknowledged her offense. Whether she believed she'd actually committed treason or was simply reciting the words expected of her, no one could say. She asked the crowd to pray for her soul and for the king's mercy toward her family. Then she knelt. She positioned her neck on the block exactly as she'd practiced. The executioner raised the axe. One clean stroke. Catherine Howard's head separated from her body and fell into the straw. Blood pooled across the scaffold. The 19-year-old who'd once been called the King's Rose without a thorn was dead. Immediately, guards brought Jane Rochford to the scaffold. She climbed the same blood-soaked steps Catherine had just walked. Jane was older, around 37, and reportedly suffered mental breakdowns during her imprisonment. Some wondered if she even understood what was happening. But when she spoke, her words were lucid and damning. She confessed that she'd been the principal cause of the Queen's ruin. She admitted arranging the midnight meetings with Thomas Culpeper. She said she deserved her fate. Then she too knelt at the block, placed her neck in position, and the executioner's axe fell a second time. 2 women executed within minutes of each other. Their bodies were wrapped in cloth and carried the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains. They were buried in unmarked graves beneath the chapel floor, next to Anne Boleyn. 3 of Henry VIII's 6 wives would eventually rest in that same chapel, casualties of a king who destroyed women when they failed to satisfy him. Outside the Tower walls, life in London continued. Markets opened, merchants sold bread, children played in the streets, and at Hampton Court Palace, Henry VIII was already considering his next marriage. The executions were over. Catherine Howard and Jane Rochford were buried beneath the chapel floor. But there was a question Tudor courtiers whispered about behind closed doors, a truth so dangerous that speaking it aloud could cost you your head. What if the real problem wasn't the Queen's at all? What if Henry VIII himself was the reason his marriages kept failing? The evidence had been building for years. In 1536, during Anne Boleyn's treason trial, one of the charges against her was that she'd mocked the king's sexual performance. She'd allegedly told her ladies-in-waiting that Henry was impotent, that he couldn't satisfy her, that his body no longer functioned as a man's should. This testimony helped condemn Anne to the scaffold, but it also planted a seed of truth that physicians and historians would recognize centuries later. Then came the Anne of Cleves marriage in 1540. Henry's own testimony about why he couldn't consummate the union revealed more than he intended. He told his doctors and council members that he experienced nocturnal emissions, wet dreams, proving his virility still existed. But that very claim exposed the problem. A functioning man shouldn't need to cite wet dreams as evidence of sexual capability. He was admitting, without realizing it, that he couldn't perform with an actual woman in his bed. His physicians knew the truth. Dr. William Butts had been treating Henry's leg ulcers since the 1530s. Massive open wounds that refused to heal, constantly seeping pus and blood. These ulcers likely resulted from varicose veins or osteomyelitis, a bone infection. The pain was excruciating. The The smell was unbearable. Henry required daily bandaging and regular cauterization, where hot irons were pressed into the wounds to burn away infected tissue. This kind of chronic pain and infection causes physiological changes: decreased testosterone, erectile dysfunction, loss of libido. By 1540, Henry weighed well over 300 pounds. His waist measured 54 inches. His armor had to be specially constructed with mechanical pulleys to lift him onto his horse. Obesity on this scale interferes with blood flow, hormone production, and sexual function. The man who'd once been a champion jouster and dancer could barely walk by the time he married Catherine Howard. But the most damning evidence came from looking at his wives' reproductive histories before and after Henry. Catherine of Aragon had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur first. That marriage produced no children and lasted only 5 months before Arthur died. Then Catherine married Henry. Over 14 years, she had 6 documented pregnancies, 2 stillbirths, 3 infant deaths within weeks of birth, and 1 surviving daughter, Mary. Modern medical analysis of those pregnancy failures suggests a rare blood incompatibility called Kell antigenicity, a condition that lies with the father's genetics, not the mother's. Anne Boleyn's pattern was similar. Multiple miscarriages, 1 surviving daughter, Elizabeth. Jane Seymour managed to produce Edward, but she died 12 days after childbirth from complications. Catherine Howard never conceived during her 16-month marriage, despite Henry claiming they had an active sexual relationship. Meanwhile, Anne of Cleves never remarried after Henry. She lived 17 more years, but had no other relationships, no children, suggesting perhaps she'd been telling the truth all along. The marriage was never consummated because Henry couldn't perform. The cruelest irony of Tudor England. A king executed 2 wives and divorced 2 others for failing to give him sons, when modern medicine suggests the fertility problems were his all along. Henry VIII's bedroom failures weren't about the women being inadequate. They were about a king too proud to admit his own body had betrayed him. Rome. Pope Clement VII received a letter from Henry VIII requesting an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The king's argument was simple. Catherine had been married to his older brother Arthur first, making their subsequent marriage invalid under biblical law. But the real reason had nothing to do with theology. Catherine was 42 years old. She'd given birth 6 times, 2 stillbirths, 3 infants who died within weeks, and 1 surviving daughter, Mary. She would never produce the male heir England needed. Henry wanted out. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. And the Pope said no. That refusal changed Western civilization. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe. Pope Clement VII couldn't afford to offend Charles by annulling his aunt's marriage to accommodate an English king's lust for a younger woman. So the Pope delayed. He formed commissions. He sent Cardinal Campeggio to England to hear the case. Years passed. Henry's patience evaporated. And by 1533, he'd decided if Rome wouldn't give him what he wanted, he'd simply break England away from Rome entirely. Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer became the architects of this revolution. Cromwell drafted the legislation. Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, provided the theological justification. Together, they constructed the legal framework that severed England from papal authority and established Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, passed in 1533, declared that England was an empire unto itself, owing no obedience to foreign powers, including the Pope. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, formally made Henry the supreme head of the Church in England. Anyone who refused to acknowledge this was guilty of treason. Sir Thomas More, Henry's former chancellor and friend, refused to swear the oath. He was beheaded in July 1535. But breaking from Rome wasn't just about divorce. It was about wealth. Between 1536 and 1540, Cromwell orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries, the systematic closure and seizure of over 800 religious houses across England. The monks and nuns were expelled. The buildings were stripped of their valuables, gold, silver, jewels, relics. The land was confiscated and sold to aristocrats loyal to Henry. The crown acquired wealth equivalent to billions in modern currency. All of this, the religious schism, the execution of dissenters, the destruction of ancient religious institutions, stemmed from one fundamental problem. Henry VIII couldn't accept that his fertility issues were preventing him from producing a male heir. He blamed Catherine of Aragon for bearing only a daughter. He blamed Anne Boleyn for her miscarriages. He blamed Anne of Cleves for her appearance. He blamed Catherine Howard for her past. Each failed marriage reinforced his conviction that the women were defective, not him. So England became Protestant. Not because of genuine theological conviction, not because of reformist ideology spreading from Martin Luther's Germany, but because a king needed to divorce his wife, and the Pope wouldn't cooperate. The English Reformation, one of the most significant religious and political transformations in European history, began in a bedroom where a middle-aged king couldn't produce a son. And when Henry finally got his male heir, Edward, born to Jane Seymour in 1537, the boy would reign only 6 years before dying at 15. All that destruction, all those executions, all that religious upheaval for a dynasty that would collapse within 2 generations. Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII, and with that union came something more valuable than love: a military alliance with the most powerful empire in Europe. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and her nephew Charles V would become Holy Roman Emperor, ruling vast territories across Spain, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. When Henry married Catherine, he wasn't just getting a wife. He was securing England's place in European power politics. For 18 years, that alliance held. England and Spain coordinated military campaigns against France. Charles V viewed Henry as an uncle by marriage, a trusted ally in the complex chess game of European diplomacy. English merchants benefited from favorable trade agreements with Spanish territories. The relationship was so strong that Charles visited England multiple times, staying at Henry's court, hunting with the king, cementing bonds that seemed unbreakable. Then, Henry decided he wanted a divorce. Charles V was furious. This wasn't just about his aunt being humiliated, though that mattered. This was about political stability. If Henry could simply discard a royal marriage because he was tired of his wife, what did that say about the sanctity of diplomatic unions? Every alliance in Europe was built on marriages between royal houses. Henry was threatening the entire system. So Charles pressured Pope Clement VII to deny the annulment. He had the military and political power to make the Pope's life very difficult if he cooperated with Henry. The result? England was isolated. The Spanish alliance collapsed. Trade routes that had favored English merchants were suddenly closed or heavily taxed. And when Henry finally broke from Rome in 1533 to marry Anne Boleyn, Charles considered invading England to restore Catherine and bring the kingdom back into Catholic obedience. The diplomatic damage was catastrophic. England went from being a respected European power with strong continental allies to being a rogue Protestant state that other Catholic kingdoms viewed with suspicion and hostility. Henry tried to repair the damage by seeking new alliances, this time with Protestant German princes. Enter the Anne of Cleves marriage in 1540. This was Thomas Cromwell's desperate attempt to build a Protestant coalition that could counter the Catholic powers of Spain and France. The Duchy of Cleves was strategically positioned in the Holy Roman Empire, and its duke had Protestant sympathies. If Henry married Anne, England would have allies in Germany, a counterweight to Charles V's dominance. But when that marriage collapsed after 6 months, so did the alliance. The Duke of Cleves was insulted. The Protestant princes questioned England's reliability, and Thomas Cromwell, who'd staked his political career on this match, lost his head on the scaffold. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, seized power, executing the architect of Protestant foreign policy. Then came Catherine Howard, Norfolk's niece, the Catholic queen, who was supposed to restore traditional alliances. Her execution in 1542 didn't just humiliate the Howard family. It signaled to Europe that England's internal politics were chaotic and unstable. No foreign power could trust a king who kept executing his wives and ministers. By 1543, when Henry married his sixth wife Catherine Parr, England was diplomatically isolated, militarily vulnerable, and politically unpredictable. All because a king's bedroom failures had cascaded into international crises. Marriage beds had become battlefields where alliances were forged and destroyed, where ministers died and dynasties trembled, where personal sexual dysfunction reshaped the map of Europe. October 12, 1537, Hampton Court Palace. After a grueling 2-day labour, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. Henry VIII finally had his male heir, the precious jewel he'd destroyed monasteries, executed wives, and broken from Rome to secure. He named the boy Edward. 12 days later, Jane Seymour died from childbirth complications. But Henry had what he needed, a legitimate son to inherit the Tudor throne. Except that son would reign for only 6 years before tuberculosis killed him at 15, and the succession crisis Henry created through his bedroom failures would nearly destroy England. When Henry died in January 1547, 9-year-old Edward VI became king. But a child couldn't rule. Despite Henry's will specifying that a council of regency should govern collectively, Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle and Jane Seymour's brother, seized power as Lord Protector within days. Court factions immediately began fighting for control. The government that had seemed so stable under Henry's authoritarian rule descended into corruption and power struggles. Edward's reign lasted 6 years. He was crowned at 9, showed promise as a scholar, and committed Protestant, but his health was always fragile. By early 1553, it was clear tuberculosis was killing him. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who'd replaced Seymour as the dominant power behind the throne, faced a terrifying problem. If Edward died, the succession would pass to Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, and Mary was Catholic. She would undo all the Protestant reforms, restore papal authority, and likely execute everyone who'd gained power under Edward. So Dudley convinced the dying 15-year-old king to alter the succession. Edward signed a document called the Device for the Succession that declared both his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, illegitimate and passed the crown to Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's daughter-in-law and a distant descendant of Henry VIII. Eighth sister. This directly contradicted Henry VIII's will and the laws of inheritance. Edward died on July 6, 1553. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. 9 days later, Mary Tudor marched into London with overwhelming popular support and took the throne. Jane Grey was executed in 1554. Mary I reigned for 5 years, attempting to restore Catholicism and earning the nickname Bloody Mary for executing Protestant reformers. She died childless in 1558. Then came Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry had executed for treason. Elizabeth's legitimacy was constantly questioned. If Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry was invalid, as Henry himself had claimed when he executed her, then Elizabeth was a bastard with no right to the throne. Yet she ruled for 45 years, navigating constant assassination plots and succession crises because she refused to marry or name an heir. The chaos all traced back to Henry's bedroom. His annulment of Catherine of Aragon made Mary illegitimate. His execution of Anne Boleyn made Elizabeth illegitimate. His rushed marriage to Jane Seymour produced a son who died at 15. His subsequent marriages to 3 more women produced no additional children. When the Tudor line finally ended with Elizabeth's death in 1603, the crown passed to the Scottish Stuarts, descendants of Henry VIII's sister Margaret. Henry V destroyed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and created England's Protestant Church, all to secure a stable succession. Instead, his bedroom failures produced 70 years of religious conflict, political instability, and disputed legitimacy that nearly tore England apart. July 1557. Richmond Palace. Anne of Cleves lay dying in her bed, surrounded by servants and attendants who genuinely mourned her. She was 41 years old and had outlived the man who'd rejected her by a decade. She'd outlived Jane Seymour, who died 12 days after giving birth to Edward. She'd outlived Catherine Howard, beheaded at 19. She'd outlived all of Henry's wives except Catherine Parr, who'd died 9 years earlier. Anne of Cleves, the woman Henry called repulsive, the Flanders mare he couldn't bear to touch, had survived by being the smartest woman in a court full of dead queens. Her strategy was simple: accept everything. When Henry demanded an annulment, she didn't fight. When he asked her to testify that their marriage was never consummated, she complied. When he offered her properties and wealth in exchange for her silence, she took them gratefully. She signed every document they placed before her. She called him her most kind and loving brother. She attended court celebrations and smiled politely, while Henry married teenager Catherine Howard. She never complained, never plotted, never gave anyone a reason to see her as a threat, and it saved her life. She received Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home. She got Richmond Palace, where Henry would eventually die. She was given an annual income that made her wealthier than almost every woman in England. She attended Elizabeth I's coronation in 1559, watching the daughter of the executed queen take the throne. She lived independently, never remarrying, maintaining her dignity and freedom for 17 years after her annulment. Meanwhile, Catherine Howard's bones lay beneath the chapel floor at the Tower of London, buried in an unmarked grave next to Anne Boleyn. 2 queens executed for failing to satisfy a king. 2 women whose heads were severed from their bodies because Henry VIII couldn't admit the truth about his own failures. Catherine died, believing she'd committed some unforgivable sin by having a sexual past before marriage. She went to her death, convinced she deserved the axe for disappointing her husband. But 5 centuries of historical analysis tells a different story. Modern medical examination of Henry's health records, the leg ulcers, the obesity, the pattern of failed pregnancies across multiple wives, suggests the real problem was never the women. Catherine of Aragon's 6 failed pregnancies likely resulted from a rare blood incompatibility carried by Henry. Anne Boleyn's miscarriages followed the same pattern. Anne of Cleves probably told the truth when she said the marriage was never consummated. Henry couldn't perform. Catherine Howard never conceived during their 16-month marriage, and given her proven fertility with other men, that suggests Henry's impotence, not hers. The cruelest legacy of Henry VIII isn't the religious reformation, or the dissolved monasteries, or even the executed ministers. It's the 2 women's heads he took because his ego couldn't survive admitting his own body had failed him. Anne of Cleves understood this. She survived by never challenging his version of events, never forcing him to confront his inadequacy. Smart women in Henry's court didn't fight back. They smiled, accepted their fate, and if they were very lucky, like Anne of Cleves, they lived long enough to watch his empire crumble after his death. The bedroom battles that changed England weren't lost by queens. They were lost by a king too proud to admit he was the problem all along.